Middle East, 1967. With lightning speed, the Israeli tankers charge into Sinai.
I had the feeling that nobody could stop us.
And slam into the massed ranks of the Egyptian Armored Corps.
It was a big mistake for them to believe that the Egyptian doesn't know how to fight.
At stake is the destiny of the Middle East.
They're willing to stand there, they're willing to duke it out with the Israelis.
2 armies, 6 days, and only one winner.
The fate of the war was in our hands.
This is the showdown in Sinai. This is the 6-day war. The desert borderlands of southern Israel. A hotly disputed corner of the Middle East, which has been torn apart by conflict. Born in the throes of violent warfare, to survive, Israel has had to learn to fight. And in the desert battles of the last 60 years, it's the tankers who've held the key to military success. From its creation in 1948, the modern state of Israel was besieged on all sides by hostile Arab neighbors, whose ambition was nothing less than its total and utter annihilation. The first Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was swiftly followed in 1956 by a second war against Egypt. And 10 years later, with the conflict still unresolved, Israel and Egypt begin to mobilize their armies once again.
Since the end of the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, the Israelis and the Arabs had constantly been pushing against each other. In 1967, all of this comes to a head. The crisis gets out of hand, Egyptian forces build up, the rhetoric on both sides escalates. It sets in train a series of events that ultimately make the war unstoppable.
As the battle lines are drawn along Israel's southern border in Sinai, Egypt can boast not only a numerical advantage, but also the superpower backing of the Soviet Union. By June of 1967, the Sinai bristles with Egyptian manpower and weapons. 100,000 men, 1,000 artillery, and more than 900 tanks.
The role of the tanks was extremely important in an open area like Sinai. In order to counter a tank, you need a tank. So it has to be tank versus tank.
Egyptian armor is overwhelmingly composed of a T-55 medium tank. It has good armor, a good gun, good mobility, and very rough and tumble in terms of being able to operate in the harsh climate of the desert.
The Soviet T-55, weighing in at less than 45 tons, is light, fast, and carries a lethal 100mm cannon, and its wide tracks make it ideal for the soft sands of the Sinai.
When you throw it all together, the T-55 is on balance a much better tank than what the Israelis have. The Israeli armored force is a hodgepodge, reflecting the fact that in 1967, Israel does not have a great power backer. The Israeli forces are using relics from the Second World War that they have collected from the scrapyards of Europe. They still have Centurions. They still have a few of the old Sherman tanks, but now there are American-made Patton tanks.
The M48 Patton medium tank, armed with a 90mm main cannon. It's more powerful than the Sherman, more reliable than the Centurion, and the best tank the Israelis can field. The only drawback is the crisis comes to a head in June of '67. The Israelis have far too few of them. Mobilizing along their southern border, the Israelis can only muster 700 tanks, 70,000 troops, and less than 200 artillery. Outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of war, Israel's only hope is to strike first and to strike hard. And out of the blue, on June 5th, that is precisely what they do.
It's fair to say that the Israelis did their homework very well, and the Egyptians were sleeping and were not ready at all.
In less than 3 hours, the Israelis destroy almost 300 planes on the ground, all but obliterating the Egyptian Air Force.
The Israelis, they have been training for this attack for almost 10 years, especially the airstrike attack.
For the Israeli tankers, the die is now cast. And at 8 o'clock, they launch their ground offensive. Their plan, a three-pronged attack blitzing into the Sinai. The northern arm, under General Israel Tal, aims to slam through the first line of Egyptian defenses at Khan Yunis and Rafah and reach El Arish, the northern gateway to Sinai.
Tal's order was, it doesn't matter how many casualties we get on the first day of the war. Whether we can communicate or not, we go forward, we shoot, and we charge. The fate of the war is in our hands.
I've decided to cross the border. And when I crossed the border, I realized that we are in the war. We drove between trees, and we couldn't move to the left and the right, and all the fire was straight to my face. After maybe 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, I lost my tank. I jumped to the second one, and after a few kilometers, I lost the second tank. And after that, I was the first Israeli tank in Khan Yunis, and they shot my tank from all over. They shot every house, many soldiers all over. They tried to stop my tank. I was the first Israeli tank, and behind me, nobody could protect me, support me. I found myself trying to protect myself, but it almost was mission impossible. I used my main gun. I shot some houses that I saw many soldiers waiting for me there. We got an order before that not to shoot with the main gun to the houses. In this moment, I said, forget about that. I fought to survive. I didn't have any experience, and even my soldiers. And I was lieutenant, young officer, running all the time, first tank, all the time. This was my mission.
By 10 o'clock, Khan Yunis has fallen. Driven by the urgency of their commander, the Israeli tankers barely pause for breath. Their next objective, Rafah.
I had a feeling that nobody could stop us. A normal man is afraid. Even I was afraid. Everybody was afraid. But no one even thought about stopping. We kept on charging. We kept on charging.
I didn't see anybody in the first moment, but suddenly I saw a black line 1 kilometer in the front of me, and I didn't know what is that, the black line. I came close, and I saw tanks. And this moment that I realized that we are in the middle of a division, and this is my mission now to attack them, of course.
June 5th, 1967. Day 1 of the Six-Day War. Israeli armored divisions strike first and crash through the Egyptian defenses in the Sinai. In the north, General Tal's division storms Khan Yunis and without stopping hurtles towards the Egyptian fixed defensive lines at Rafah.
So they realized that if they can move faster and think faster and make decisions faster than the Egyptians, they can constantly catch the Egyptians at a disadvantage.
Everything happened all of a sudden in one day or so. So it was a big surprise.
I realized that we are in the middle of a division, and this is my mission now to attack them, of course. In Rafah, I put all the tanks beside of my tanks, and it was the first time that I used all of them together. We couldn't stop because it go, 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 go all the time. People support each other, you know. It's some tanks stop for a moment, and other tanks move forward, and they cover each other.
Egyptian forces demonstrate a real capacity to fight from fixed defensive positions. It's what they're best at. They're willing to stand there, they're willing to duke it out with the Israelis. If you put them in a position where they feel comfortable, where they feel like they can fight back, they will fight back hard.
They build special places like fire position. They cover themselves with the dune, with the sand. And just the top of the turret we saw. I remember one of them was 1 meter in the front of my tank, and I saw him. And of course we moved the gun and we shot him back. The enemy can be in shock when you don't stop. Even you lose few tanks. Don't stop, move and move and move, and be behind him. You run so fast. When you stop, you are a good target. When they realize that they cannot stop us, they jump from the tunnel and they start to run away from us. And they took off the shoes and they threw away the rifles and they start to run to the ocean.
By noon, the Egyptian forward defensive line at Rafah is decisively breached. Reeling from the explosive speed of the Israeli advance, the Egyptian high command is in a state of denial.
The fog of war descends very heavily on Egyptian forces. It is humiliating for the Arab commanders to admit that the Israelis, that the Jews, are beating them. And so rather than admit that they're losing, they claim the exact opposite. They claim to be succeeding. They claim to be beating the Israelis back. And so when those Israeli formations that have now penetrated the Egyptian front lines begin to push into the deeper Egyptian positions, those Egyptians farther back are totally unready for them.
By early afternoon, the first Israeli units reached the Geradi Defile, a heavily fortified choke point on the road to El Arish, where they catch the Egyptians off guard.
I approached the Geradi. The Geradi is a narrow passage like the route to Jerusalem. This terrain is very difficult with soft dunes and landmines. So I decided to go back to the technique of moving in a column with 3 tanks shooting forward. The Egyptians began shooting at us from the right and from the left. We returned fire. We saw a few burning flames. I gave an order that every tank that is hit is moved to the side. They take out the crew and we continue moving. We won't bother with repairing tanks during this battle.
The first Israeli tanks break through the Geradi at breakneck speed. But for those following on behind, the element of surprise has been lost.
And as a result, when the main body of the Israeli force comes to the Geradi Pass, unlike its vanguard, they now face an Egyptian foe who is dug in, armed, and waiting for them.
I didn't know that a few hours before, 2 companies crossed the Geradi already. I didn't know that. Nobody told me that. Suddenly I saw 2 soldiers beside of the road. I looked to his faces. He was so feared and scared. And he said something like, "Be careful. You have many tanks here." Suddenly it was a big bomb on the tank.
June 5th, 1967. Israeli tanks smash through Rafah and charge into northern Sinai. The lightning speed of their attack catches the Egyptians off guard, and the lead tanks of General Tal's armored division punch through the Geradi Defile. But by the time the main body arrives, the Egyptians are ready and waiting for them.
Suddenly I saw 2 soldiers beside of the road. And he said something like, "Be careful. You have many tanks here." And I decided to move the main gun and put it in the direction that my gunner would try to identify them. And I moved down to talk with him and to give them the direction. At this moment, suddenly, it was a big bomb on the tank. At this moment I say, bye-bye the world. Shalom to the world. And then I started to scream. All my body was on fire. 2 of my crew was killed. My deputy, that I was in his tank, and the loader, they were killed, both of them.
Outnumbered from the outset, the Israelis can ill afford casualties. And by mid-afternoon of day 1, their losses mount alarmingly.
I looked around and said to myself, seeing this, such a heavy price for the first battle, what is going to be next? My feeling after this battle was not fear, but worry. If this is how the war continues, we won't be able to carry on with so many wounded.
They found a real war in all aspects of the world, and they have to fight, and they have to suffer, and they lost lots of their men and their armored forces.
And the 7th Armored Brigade, the elite of the Israeli army, suffers its heaviest losses during that combat in the Geradi Pass. They just have to fight it out, yard by yard, pushing the Egyptians back. And there ensues one of the most ferocious fights of the entire Six-Day War.
We organized ourselves, and I got a mission to advance and conquer Girardi. We took control of the commanding terrain, and we started to hit the Egyptians that sat at the Girardi from behind. When a defending force sits in dugouts, in positions and bunkers, it was very difficult for it to change direction. We attacked tanks, cannons, and bunkers from the rear. That is what actually broke them. And then they started to flee, and that was the collapse of the Girardi.
Tal's division surges through the Girardi towards El Arish. But their momentum is so fast and so furious that their position is now dangerously overstretched. The Egyptians send their elite 4th Armored Division north to hit the Israelis hard in the flank. But racing through the desert to head them off where they least expect it is the 2nd arm of the Israeli offensive under General Avraham Yaffe. South of the coastal roads, the Egyptians believe the trackless desert to be impassable to armored vehicles and impenetrable to tanks, but not General Yaffe.
Our move was especially surprising because they didn't expect us to come from a direction they thought impassable. There were heavy dunes on the right side and heavy dunes on the left side. And we advanced on that path.
Now the going's tough, and a lot of Israeli tanks do get stuck, and it is hard to get the forces through there. When Yoffe's forces get to the other side, they're strung out, they're piecemeal, they're a little bit helter-skelter.
And their task now is to intercept the Egyptian 4th Armored Division, which is advancing with hundreds of deadly T-55 main battle tanks.
This was a tank battle that was perhaps one of the biggest since World War II.
June 6th. In the north of Sinai, General Tal's divisions have breached the Egyptian front line. But now his flank is dangerously exposed. The tanks of General Yaffe's division speed through the desert in a race to head off a massive Egyptian counterattack. At Bir Lafan, the two sides come face to face. 200 Soviet tanks of the elite Egyptian 4th Armored Division against just 100 Israeli Centurions.
When the Egyptian reserves, the elements of the 4th Armored Division, get to Bir Lafan, all of a sudden, completely unexpectedly, they are faced with an Israeli tank battalion. And the Israelis go up against the best formation in the Egyptian army, the 4th Armored Division.
The first thing you see is the dust approaching. And then you understand that there is an enemy force. The first thing, you need to look at the field. and check how you can exploit the field to your advantage.
The Israelis capitalize on a certain limited range of advantages that they have over the Egyptians. First, the Israelis have become expert at long-range gunnery. The superb guns on the Centurion allow the Israelis to engage the Egyptian forces at much longer ranges than the Egyptians realistically can.
We opened fire at a range of 1,500 to 2,000 yards.
The 58-ton British Centurion in service since 1945 has been upgraded by the Israelis with a 105mm cannon, giving it more firepower and a greater striking range than the Egyptians' T-55.
If you have better cannons and a good fire control system, and if you are trained well, then of course, if you can hit from a bigger range than the enemy, it gives you a great advantage.
The Israelis have learned that the best way to kill tanks is not just by shooting them head-on, but to get on their flanks, hit them in the side, hit them in the rear.
There is a saying in the armored corps that the best tank is the tank that has the best crew. Sometimes the crew is more important than the tank.
The combat itself is a swirling tank fight that plays to all of Egypt's disadvantages and all of Israel's advantages.
If you have tanks that are heavy, less to maneuver, slow, and countered by faster tanks, or more maneuvering, you left limb back in the sand.
The Israeli tankers maneuver constantly. They dart from firing position to firing position. They get out on the Egyptian flanks. The Egyptians lumber forward clumsily in large formations that are very difficult for them to maneuver. At the end of the day, the Egyptian armored force is defeated. It is smashed against only very light losses on the Israeli side.
General Yafi's Centurions destroy as many as 80 Egyptian tanks. The rest of them flee. But the Israelis still face their biggest challenge. Farther south at Abu Aguila, the third arm of the Israeli offensive under General Ariel Sharon has an even tougher task: to crack open the massive Egyptian fortifications, defending the main axis of advance into central Sinai.
The Egyptians in 1967 are on the defensive. They have the advantage of being able to sit behind very well-developed Soviet-aided fortifications, trench lines, deep minefields, positions dug in depth, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery fire zones.
They're the heaviest fortifications in the whole of Sinai. The task of breaking through falls to Battalion Commander Nat Gainier.
Arik told me that he can't give me any artillery backup because I was too far from him, and that this mission would be on my own. All the trenches had been constructed to a Soviet design with cement walls. There were many tank battalions, a lot of infantry and artillery force. It was hard to find places to climb up the dunes without sleeping. They also had anti-tank missiles, and this was a problem. The first attack wasn't going our way. We lost many tanks.
It was a big mistake for them to believe that the Egyptian doesn't know how to fight.
I reassigned new people, company commanders. One company commander died, another was injured. 4 platoon commanders died. I was able to plan the best way to attack. You can only go up on the back of the dunes. Otherwise, you slip off them. I found a place where I would be successful. And then I conquered.
The initial breaching operation is a tough one for the Israelis that costs them a great deal of the casualties that they take in the entire operation. But once they're through those fortified defenses, they are effectively free.
Their mission now, encircle and destroy the Egyptians' defensive stronghold at Abu Aguila, in what will become one of the most audacious maneuvers in the history of armored warfare. Central Sinai. The tanks of Ariel Sharon's division penetrate the Egyptians' formidable fortified defensive line. Their mission, to wreak havoc on the Egyptian stronghold at Abu Aguila.
Sharon's plan to deal with the Egyptian defensive system at Abu Aguila is to hit it from all sides. He pushes a battalion task force of armor through the soft sand dunes north of the Abu Aguila lines.
Their main weapon is surprise. And maneuvering in the dead of night, confusion reigns.
The Egyptian tanks that were sent against me got mixed up and got into my convoy. And by the sound of their engines, we knew they weren't Centurions. And the cannons were directed to the right or the left, depending on what side the Egyptian tanks were. And as we were driving, we left them on their own, shot them and destroyed them.
After hours of treacherous maneuvers in enemy territory, they ride into the Egyptians' unprotected rear.
They prepared for a frontal attack, straight in front of me, from east to west. They didn't think even for 1 second that tanks or vehicles can cross the dunes. So I passed through firing as we moved. I also turned around cannons to the right and cannons to the left, in 2 columns. I went into the area of their supply and command. It was like in a movie. You enter and they were surprised. And we shot with cannons and machine guns, and it all caught on fire. All of their supply, all of their fuel, the ammunition, everything. Their command headquarters, it was all burning. It all exploded. The entire place was on fire. When we finished one pass through, we turned around and came back.
But Nir's attack has alerted the Egyptian armored reserve, which in desperation throws itself into the fray.
Egyptian units tend to stick together, they will hold together, they will fight as units for long periods of time, even in very poor, even desperate circumstances, when other formations of other armies might fall apart.
Without knowing where we are, they just moved around like mice. And that was the end of them. The moment I felt something was there, we turned on the big projector for a few seconds, just so the gunner puts the cross on the target. You shoot one low, one high, and destroy the Egyptian tank. At night, suddenly we were 10 yards, 15 yards away from 6 tanks, 7 tanks. 4 times they tried to attack us. The tanks caught on fire. We destroyed all of these attacks. When the tankers jumped out, they were burning like torches from their tanks. A horrible and terrible sight. At the same time, many of our projectors were being shot at and disabled. The Egyptians shot projectors that were turned on for too long a time. It was very difficult not to crack, but thanks to the movement from the rear, it all began to collapse.
With the decisive Israeli victory at Abu Aguila, the Egyptians faced defeat on all 3 fronts.
Cairo realizes that the jig is up. And at that point in time, Field Marshal Amr makes one of the worst decisions in military history. He simply orders all Egyptian forces to retreat. And they should get back across the Suez Canal as quickly as they possibly can.
That was a disaster. That was the biggest disaster. And they received the order to withdraw in 24 hours, which is technically impossible. A good withdrawal technique should take at least 1 week. It should happen during the night.
The retreat becomes a rout. Huge numbers of Egyptian tanks flee westwards. Unaware Israeli tanks lie in wait, blocking their escape route. The Sinai, June 6th. In a space of less than 36 hours, the Egyptian tank divisions are routed by the Israelis, and they flee the battlefield. One of their main routes of escape lies through the Mitla Pass, leading to the Suez Canal and the safety of Egypt beyond. But in a headlong dash, the Israeli 200th Brigade gets there first.
Sitting at the mouth of the Mitla Pass is a tiny little armored force, no more than a dozen Israeli tanks, led by Bren Edan.
I gave an order to the 200th Brigade to send the battalion quickly to the Mitle and block them.
He has basically taken as many tanks as he could, run south as fast as he could, and every time they began to run out of gas, he'd siphon it out of the tanks to keep as many as he could running to get down to the Mitla Pass with this tiny little force. And there they engage in one of the great feats of long-range gunnery of the modern world. Using their long-range gunnery skills to keep the Egyptians at bay, they keep an enormous force of Egyptians from getting through the Mitla Pass until additional reinforcements are finally able to come up hours later and seal off the Mitla altogether.
Its escape route blocked, the Egyptian armor now falls easy prey to the Israeli Air Force. With the Egyptian army left reeling, the Israeli tankers press on through the Mitla Pass towards their ultimate prize beyond, the Suez Canal, and complete domination of the Sinai.
In the west side, what surprised me, that the Egyptian army was not in a situation of withdrawal. They just stopped their withdrawal there. I realized that I have a real enemy in front of me. I knew that from the terrain point of view, the maneuvering is going to be very difficult, so I must use something which is very fundamental in any war. This is surprise. I talked to all the tank commanders, and I told them, look, I'm going to do something which is unusual. With open lights, and we will go towards the Suez Canal. If we will face the enemy, we will shoot, we will fight. But it could be that the enemy will feel that it's Egyptian troop going, because otherwise they will not understand about the light. Just be ready with the guns to the right, to the left. The only one who will give you orders to shoot is myself. And we start moving, and you know, it was quiet. Nothing happened. All of a sudden, when the sun came up, we were in the middle of a big deployment of armor and infantry, and it was a big surprise. I hold the fire and said, don't shoot, because this army is a defeated army. I'm not going to start a massacre, because both sides will suffer. Once they raise their hand, we won the battle without even one single shot.
It has taken the Israelis just 3 days to destroy the Egyptian army and reach the Suez Canal. Their conquest of Sinai is absolute.
It's fair to say the military leadership on the Egyptian part were not up to the challenge or up to the responsibility at all. The army was not really ready and trained and prepared to fight a war in Sinai against the Israelis. To lose it bad in 2-3 days, that was kind of humiliating.
In the course of a brief campaign, the Egyptians have lost more than 10,000 men and 700 tanks. For the Israelis, victory also comes at a price, with 1,400 casualties and more than 60 tanks destroyed. But for their tankers, the 6-day war is nothing short of a triumph.
Israel's victory in the Six-Day War is one of the most stunning military accomplishments of the 20th century. A small Israeli force takes on a larger, better-equipped Egyptian force, dug in the right places in the Sinai Peninsula, and they not just defeat it, they destroy it.
We knew there wasn't any other option. Either you win or you die. There is no middle way. There is nowhere to retreat. There is no place to escape.
Outgunned and outnumbered, a small but highly trained Israeli tank force has proved to be unstoppable.
The tank's qualities are important, but they are not the main issue. The saying goes, it's not the steel that counts, but the men that's driving the steel.